بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطاهرين ما دام ما في السماوات والأرضين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما اللهم إنا نسألك علما ينفعنا اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وعملا متقبلا وشفاء من كل داء نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, by the grace and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have now reached lesson number 128. Number 128 reads as Al-Istibra. Normally, in contemporary times, we would skip this particular chapter because it deals with issues relating to slaves. Slave girls in particular. A person owns a concubine. What are the rules and regulations when a person assumes ownership of a slave girl? And when this particular ownership is terminated, what are the rules and regulations? So normally this type chapter would be skipped. We are going to be dealing with it, albeit very briefly, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for two reasons. The first reason would be that we want to have a comprehensive read of a fiqh manual, in other words, covering the text from cover to cover. So in other words, in fulfillment of the trust which has been entrusted to us, number one. And number two is there are many benefits in terms of reading the issues. One such benefit we will highlight very shortly, and that is what would the difference be in terms of istibra. A person purchases a slave girl that happens to be a Muslim slave girl. Can he have relations with her? He may, on condition that there is an istibra. How does istibra differ from what you and I are by now familiar with in terms of an iddah, a waiting period? A husband passes away, we have a widower, or a lady is divorced, she goes into a waiting period. It is similar, istibra is similar to a waiting period, however there are certain salient differences which we will discuss bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the course of our reading. So today's class number 128, may be a bit shorter than other classes in a sense that we're going to be working through the text and providing basic explanatory notes bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we will not be getting into that amount of detail that we normally do in terms of unpacking the text in light of the explanatory notes provided by Taqiyuddin al-Hisni. So let's get into the text immediately bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It reads as follows. The text reads as follows. وَمَنِ اسْتَحْدَثَ مِلْكَ أَمَةٍ حَرُمَ عَلَيْهِ الْإِسْتِمْتَاعُ بِهَا حَتَّى يَسْتَبْرِئَهَا إن كانت من ذوات الحيض بحيضة وإن كانت من ذوات الشهور فبشهر وإن كانت من ذوات الحمل فبوضع الحمل والله أعلم. So let's do a working translation of the text. من استحدث ملك أمة. استحدث is on the 10th scale. The root letters are حدث. من استحدث, whoever seeks the ownership of a slave girl. In other words, a person purchases a slave girl. What is the ruling? He becomes the owner of the slave girl, but in terms of conjugal relations, or rather in terms of sexual relations, akramakumullah, may Allah honor you, what is the ruling? The text reads, حَرُمَ عَلَيْهِ الْإِسْتِمْتَاعُ بِهَا. It is impermissible for him to gain any sexual gratification from her, حَتَّى يَسْتَبْرِئَهَا, until he makes istibra. In other words, she goes into a form of a waiting period. We're going to look at that in detail bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we look at the explanatory notes. For now, it is impermissible for him to have sexual intercourse with her or any other form of sexual gratification حَتَّى يَسْتَبْرِئَهَا, until she goes into an istibra. How will this istibra be determined? إن كانت من ذوات الحيض, if she happens to be experiencing her menses. In other words, she has a regular menstruation cycle. She will bleed for a few days of the month and then she will be clean for the balance of the month, by way of example. If that's the case, if that's the status quo of the slave girl in question, then her istibra term, istibra again, if we look at the very literal meaning of the word istibra, it's on the 10th scale. istibra, seeking to be absolved. Seeking to be absolved of what? To ensure before the master has relations with her that she is free from child, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So if the slave girl in question happens to be one that experiences a menstrual cycle, and then we're going to work out her istibra, how? Bihaydatin. The moment she has one hayd, after that particular hayd, she goes into a clean period, we would now consider the istibra to be complete. وَإِنْ كَانَتْ مِنْ ذَوَاتِ الشُّهُورِ. The lady in question, the slave girl that has been purchased by way of example, she doesn't fall into the category of women folk menstruating. Rather, we're going to work out her cycle, we're going to work out her period in terms of istibra, we're going to work it out in terms of months. Let's say it's an elderly slave girl, she's into menopause, she doesn't experience her menstrual cycle, we're going to work it out according to months. How many months? The text read of Abu Shuja, it reads بِشَهْرٍ, with a single month. وَإِنْ كَانَتْ مِنْ ذَوَاتِ الْحَمَلِ. Alternatively, if a person purchases a slave girl and the slave girl happens to be pregnant, before he may engage in any type of sexual activity, it is important that, not important, but rather it is mandatory that she go into a form of istibra, and for a pregnant lady is going to be بِوَضْعِ الْحَمَلِ, when she gives birth. It means now that her istibra had come to an end, and it is permissible for the slave master to engage in relations with her. That's basically a working translation in terms of the text that we have in front of us. What I'm going to do now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is I'm going to look at the definition of the term istibra, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the definition of the term istibra reads as follows. Allow me a moment, barakallahu fikum. You can check and just explain to the gentleman that we're in class, and then I'll continue as we go along. Barakallahu fikum. Sorry for that intermission. So we're now going to look at the definition of the term istibra. The definition of the term istibra. Istibra refers to a necessary waiting period due to ownership of a slave girl when acquiring it and when terminating it. So as we have worked through the translation, what we have discovered basically is that istibra, when you purchase a slave girl, or for example the master passes away, so in other words that particular ownership is terminated, what happens at that particular juncture? The following: the lady has to go into an istibra. So istibra refers to a necessary waiting period due to ownership of a slave girl when acquiring it and when terminating it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. As I mentioned earlier, the important part for us, or one of the benefits in terms of discussing the rules and regulations relating to istibra, is that we can juxtapose the phenomenon of istibra to the phenomenon of iddah. So what's the difference between the two? And this is very beneficial for myself. As we know, the ruling reads, Al-ashya'u tu'rafu bi'adadiha. Things are known by its opposites. So when we understand the concept of istibra, it also assists us in understanding the concept of iddah. So istibra, what does istibra refer to? هو مقدر بأقل ما يدل على البراءة من غير عدة. The definition is given as follows. Istibra, a person acquires the ownership that of a slave girl. He wants to have relationship with her. The condition is that she must fulfill the criterion of istibra. What is the criterion? She basically has to wait for one menstrual cycle. In other words, she has to experience, be it 5 days, be it 6 days, be it 7 days, she must have a bleeding cycle. The moment that bleeding cycle is finished and she goes into a clean period now, it means that the istibra requirement has been fulfilled. So now istibra by definition is what? Huwa muqaddarun. It is determined, if you want to, it is measured, it is kept bi'aqalli, with the least in terms of time period or indicator, which indicates upon what? Ma yadullu ala al-bara'ati, which indicates to the fact that she is not with child. Ala al-bara'ati min ghayri iddatin, without it repeating itself. Whereas, if we now look to iddah, a lady is divorced, so she goes into a waiting period. And in terms of our understanding, a very clear understanding, it is that وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ, that a lady who's been divorced, she will go into a waiting period. What is the waiting period? ثلاثة قروء. It will basically be 3 clean periods. So what do I have? Can one not say that the moment she has one bleeding period and then she enters into a clean period, that menstrual cycle, isn't that sufficient in establishing the fact that this particular lady is not with child? In relation to istibra, yes, but not in relation to an iddah. And that's why the iddah is referred to as an iddah. Iddah means to count. So this process is not only done once. The process is done once, twice, and thrice. And therefore, in terms of iddah, it is referred to as follows. And I'm going to refer to the text now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It reads as follows. وَسُمِّيَتْ الْعِدَّةُ عِدَّةً. وَجْهُ التَّسْمِيَةِ. The reason why a particular phenomenon is referred to in a particular way. Why is iddah referred to as iddah? Because لِتَعَدُّدِ مَا يَدُلُّ عَلَى الْبَرَاءَةِ. Because of the multiplicity. We're not going to suffice ourselves with one cycle that indicates that the lady is without child, but rather we're going to repeat the process thrice over, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And therefore our scholars, I would always remember them mentioning that in terms of iddah, it's like you have two underlying reasoning. The one underlying reasoning is the very logical one, that a lady, she's divorced, she goes into a waiting period. Why does she go into a waiting period? She goes into a waiting period in order to ensure that she's without child before she gets married to another person. So one might argue along those particular lines and say, if that's the underlying reason, can't we use another measure? What would another measure be? A lady can go for a pregnancy test. A lady could go for a scan, and categorically one can determine that she's without child. Would that be valid? Our scholars are going to say no. Why? Because there's another element to an iddah. And what is that particular element? Number one, the repeated process. And number two would be there is a logical reasoning, and also there is a religious reasoning, what we would refer to as ad-dalil al-aqli and dalil al-tawqifi. There's a proof that basically goes in accordance with logic, and then there's another proof in terms of religiosity. We're saying that a lady must wait 3 terms, so to say. Why? There's a logic behind it, yes, in terms of once, but there's also a religious aspect to it. Allah commands the lady to go into a waiting period, and He also stipulates that it be 3 clean periods, and we submit to that. Sami'na, we have heard the command, wa ata'na, and we obey the command in that particular regard, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Back to our topic of discussion, we are talking about purchasing a slave girl. When you acquire ownership of the slave girl goes into an istibra. What is the proof for that? The proof reads as follows. قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the following narration of the Prophet Muhammad صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم, that reads as follows. What does it say? لا توطأ حامل حتى تضع. In relation to a slave girl, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم, what does he say? He says لا توطأ حامل حتى تضع. If it is that you purchased a slave girl and she happens to be pregnant, then sexual intercourse will not be had with her until she gives birth. وَلَا غَيْرَ ذَاتِ حَمْلٍ حَتَّى تَحِيضَ حَيْضَةً. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he continues and he says, and neither a non-pregnant lady. So a person gets married to a non-pregnant lady. Rather, what we are discussing is a person acquires the ownership of a non-pregnant slave girl. Marriage on the one hand, and here we have the acquisition of a slave girl. وَلَا غَيْرُ ذَاتِ حَمْلٍ. It is not permissible, or sexual intercourse will not be had with a non-pregnant slave girl حَتَّى تَحِيضَ حَيْضَةً, until she experiences one bleeding cycle, and Allah SWT knows best. This particular narration is narrated by Abu Dawud, and Imam al-Hakim has considered it to be vigorously authenticated. وَقَالَهُ عَلَى شَرْطِ Muslim. Rather, he has gone beyond that and said that this particular narration, it meets the stringent criterion set by Imam Muslim in terms of authenticity. We go on to the next topic now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and here the author will discuss the causes of istibra. We had already looked at the first one very clearly, and that is when a person assumes ownership of a slave girl. When you purchase a slave girl on the slave market, or you may come by the ownership of a slave girl in different ways, as will be mentioned in a moment, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When that happens, that is the causative factor. That is the reason why istibra needs to be made. We look at that detail now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first cause for istibra would be when you acquire the ownership that of a slave girl. We look at the detail now. The detail reads as follows. More an unpacking rather than detail. It says whether the ownership is by, so you acquire the ownership of a slave girl, whether it is by inheritance, a person inherits a slave girl. Tamam. Alternatively, a person purchases a slave girl. It may very well be that the person receives a slave girl as a gift. It might very well be a bequest. A person, you have a certain relative, the relative has slave girls, and in his will they leave a bequest that you become the owner of the slave girl. Or it may be in war times that as a result of war, the slave girl is a prisoner of war and you acquired through that particular means. Or you may be a slave trader and a person sells a slave and that slave is returned due to a defect found within the slave girl. The slave master decides, well, I'm going to keep the slave girl for myself. Can he engage in sexual relations with her? No, until istibra is made. Even if it may be by way of iqala. Iqala basically means when I sell something to you, for no reason you would like to return what I've sold to you. In this instance, I sold a slave girl to you. I sold a slave girl to you. For no apparent reason, there's no defect or anything that justifies the return of the slave girl. It may just have been an impulse purchase on your side. So you return the slave girl. I am accommodating. I'm willing to return your money and take the slave girl back. So I'm taking the slave girl back. What do I have to do now? In that particular instance, I've reassumed the ownership of the slave girl and therefore istibra has to take place and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Alternatively, I may have a gift and I gift it to my son by way of example. I have a slave girl and I gift the slave girl in the service of my son. What happens in that particular instance? I retract the slave girl. My son is not fulfilling the rights of the slave girl, not looking after her and maintaining her as he should. So I retract that particular gift. When I retract the gift, it means that the ownership once again comes into my sphere. I once again assume ownership of the slave girl. Then to whenever, in whatever way ownership is assumed, a person has to follow the procedure of istibra, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Then whether the slave girl, the detail goes on. The rule is when you assume ownership of a slave girl, then istibra has to be made. You may come up with a number of circumstances, and Taqiyuddin al-Hisni is going to mention these over here. So what does he say? Whether the slave girl is pregnant or otherwise, istibra still needs to be fulfilled. Whether the slave girl happens to be a virgin or a non-virgin, it is inconsequential. Istibra must take place. For example, let's say you purchase a slave girl and somehow or the other, the laws relating to the purchase of a slave girl comes with a certificate. And it's a verified doctor's certificate that determines whether the slave girl or informs you that the slave girl is a virgin or non-virgin. So the certificate reads, this is a virgin slave girl that you've purchased. Would that suffice? In other words, now there's no need for istibra? No. Whether the slave girl that you have acquired by any form of ownership, whether that particular slave girl is a virgin or non-virgin, istibra must still be made. The third provision that is looked at over here, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, would be it's inconsequential whether the previous owner was a male, female, or a child. So one might think, if the previous owner was a woman, and then you wouldn't have conjugal relations or any type of sexual relations, or a child for that matter. It's of no consequence. Whether the previous owner was a male, female, or child is of no consequence. Istibra needs to be made, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Furthermore, number 4, whether istibra was made before or not. So you are intent to purchase a slave girl. So you tell yourself, I'd like to purchase a slave girl, but I want to have relations with her immediately after I purchase her. So I have to sort out the istibra. But you arrange with the previous owner that you effect the istibra process. So by the time I purchase her, she would have already underwent or undergone the istibra process. Would that suffice? No. from the point of ownership, thereafter istibra has to take place, and Allah SWT knows best. Where are we getting all of these rulings from? It is based on the generality of the tradition, despite the fact that at the time, the Prophet ﷺ would simply know that there are different circumstances in terms of the owner. There would be different circumstances in terms of the slave girl being purchased. She may be a virgin, she may be non-virgin, whatever the case may be. But despite that, the Prophet ﷺ said, in any and under all circumstances, istibra needs to take place, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We go on to the next part of the discussion. We've before looked at, what have we looked at? Let's look now at this particular text. What have we looked at? We've looked at the causes of istibra. In other words, why do you need to make istibra? Number one, when assuming ownership of a slave girl, that we've discussed a moment ago. The second cause would be death. So if a person passes away, for example, a person has a slave girl, he had conjugal relations with her. This particular slave girl is referred to as Walad. If the master passes away, then in relation to this Walad, she has to go under a process of istibra. Wallahu a'lam. And the text now reads as follows. The text now from Abu Shuja. Whatever is written in black in terms of our PowerPoint presentation, that represents the text by Abu Shuja. So the text of Abu Shuja now mentions the second cause of istibra. And what does it say? وَإِذَا مَاتَ سَيِّدُ أُمُّ الْوَلَدِ, when the master of this particular slave girl, and this particular slave girl is referred to as Ummul Walad, when the master passes away, istabrat nafsaha kal amati, then she will seek to make istibra that of herself like a normal slave girl, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And the following is added over here bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm going to read through that, and it will bring us to the end of this particular class number 128. هذا هو السبب الثاني. This is the second cause مما يوجب الاستبراء, which necessitates istibra, وهو زوال الفراش عن موطوءة بملك يمين. What does it mean? Literally, زوال الفراش, the bed no longer exists, from one with whom intercourse had taken place as a result of the master owning that particular slave girl. In other words, when the master of a slave girl with whom he has had a relationship with, when he passes away, what happens? She doesn't go into what we refer to as an iddah. She goes into what we refer to as istibra, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Thus, فَإِذَا مَاتَ سَيِّدٌ أَنْ أُمِّ وَلَدِهِ وَلَيْسَتْ فِي زَوْجَةٍ وَلَا عِدَّةٍ نِكَاحٍ. So when a master passes away and he leaves behind a slave girl with whom he has had conjugal relations, and there is no marriage, there is no waiting period relating to a marriage, لازمها الاستبراء, it is necessary upon her to enter into the istibra and fulfill the requirements of istibra. لأنه زال عنها الفراش فأشبت حرة, because that bed, if we can phrase ourselves as such, that bed no longer exists. Now when we look at the marriage, when the husband passes away, that bed also no longer exists, and that's basically the similarity. So like a free lady goes into a waiting period, a slave girl with whom the master had had conjugal relations, she'll go into a waiting period, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. What is the extent of this waiting period? وَاسْتِبْرَاؤُهَا بِشَهْرٍ إِنْ كَانَتْ مِنْ ذَوَاتِ الْأَشْهُرِ. Either it will be a month, or it will be a single bleeding period. فَلَوْ أَعْتَقَهَا فَالْأَمْرُ كَذَلِكَ. If he were to set her free, and then the same rules would apply. This brings us to the end of lesson number 128. As we said, it's going to be a brief lesson. We're covering it for the reasons which has been mentioned. Our next lesson will be lesson number 129, and that relates to the obligations towards a mu'tadda. A lady goes into a waiting period. What are the obligations on the husband towards the wife, towards the divorcee who is now divorced? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Till we meet again, barakallahu fikum jami'an. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.